And maybe I'll start just with a little bit of background about myself, so you can position your questions according to that. So I'm not here representing Turkish Civil Society. I'm an academic, an anthropologist, but I've been doing research on migration topics in Turkey for close to 15 years. And I have, in the course of this research, also worked with a number of different non-governmental organizations in Turkey, but also I've done some research with for the EU, so consultancy research for the EU. So I've kind of worked with very closely with a lot of different kinds of NGOs in Turkey who work in the migration field. So I'll be sharing more kind of my observations on kind of how civil society linked with migration in Turkey has evolved over the course of the past decade. And well, just to tell you a little bit about kind of civil society in Turkey generally, to give you a context, I don't know how similar it is to the Greek one, but basically in Turkey, kind of the emergence of civil society really goes to the 1990s, where they started expanding, kind of becoming more institutionalized, more professional, and this was partly linked with kind of democratic reforms in Turkey in the 2000s, the EU accession process, kind of the support given by the EU to develop civil society in Turkey, but also the kind of a big turning point, it was the 1999 earthquake in Turkey. And kind of since then, basically in the 2000s, you really saw a rapid expansion of civil society in Turkey. And mainly, kind of if you typologize what groups there are. There's faith-based NGOs, and then given Turkey's kind of religious ideology and the division between the seculars and the religious camps, you also have what we call the secular NGOs. And then this is kind of contrast to the rights-based NGOs, and then kind of professional organizations, associations like syndicates and unions. So kind of this is the main typology of NGOs operating in Turkey. But when you look at in relation to civil society in Turkey operating in the migration field, this is kind of more recent. In the 1990s, the associations that were working in the migration field were what kind of you can classify as communal solidarity associations. So these were, like Iraqi Turkmens or Afghan Turkmens coming to Turkey, many of them having acquired citizenship. So it was more kind of co-ethnic groups who had access to citizenship and therefore kind of had also easier access to organize. So I think, in the previous session, there was this question about why are migrant communities not organizing, making opportunities. We need to recognize kind of what are the structural impediments. So when you look at it in Turkey during the 1990s, the groups that organized were actually ones who had access to citizenship and kind of ethnic, religious, bias, let's say, because of proximity. But then the 1990s also saw a turning point, not because of, partly because of refugee arrivals in Turkey from Iraq, and because of the wars in the Balkans, but also Turkish civil society developed kind of an international lens. So Turkish civil society having operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, and this was mainly large kind of religious charity associations starting to operate. But then you also, as I mentioned, with the rights-based NGOs in Turkey, they started integrating the issue of refugee rights into their work. There's some names on my PowerPoint. Yeah, I won't go into the details, but kind of the real turning point for obvious reasons, the scale of the refugee problem after 2011 meant that kind of the issue of refugees and migrants in Turkey became really core to civil society initiatives in Turkey. But just to give you, this wasn't immediate, it wasn't automatic. Like suddenly in 2011, refugees arrived and civil society was all in hands assisting refugees. Actually, it was much more a slow response, and there's different reasons. One of it is because the refugees, when they initially came across the border, they were actually kept in camps, contained in camps in the first kind of 2 years. At least that's what the government tried to do. Also, kind of, I mentioned, these ideological divides. So the Turkish civil society, the seculars, and kind of more pro-government NGO were divided ideologically on the arrival of Syrian refugees into Turkey. So, for instance, the secular NGOs, kind of who are opposing the AKP government's Syria policy, were a little bit more hesitant about kind of entering this field. But also, in terms of international NGOs, there were several restrictions that the government placed on their operations in Turkey. So, kind of between 2011 and 2013, 2013, you don't see kind of the scale of civil society engagement in the refugee problem as you do today. And the reason it changed in 2013 was because suddenly it was no longer contained in camps. Today, of the close to 4 million refugees in Turkey, only about 150,000 are in camps, so about 97% are actually what we call urban refugees. And obviously the state recognized that, this was kind of beyond their limits in terms of providing services. Also, there was a recognition that the situation was no longer temporary. It was perceived that the Syrians were the guests and they would stay as long as guests are welcome to stay. But suddenly, today we're in the 8th year of the crisis, and the state recognized that, it was time to move towards kind of integration policies. But also, when the state opened its doors to international funding, such as EU funding or UN, different donor programs, one of the requirements is that, for instance, with the UN programs, is that the funding has to be channeled through local civil society, national civil society. So, the government had to kind of recognize that this is how they operate. But also, in terms of how civil society was engaged with the refugee issue, you also see kind of a fluctuation. So in the initial years of the crisis, it was more of a kind of an emergency. Obviously, it was a humanitarian crisis at the time, so there was more of an emergency response and kind of rapid service delivery. So you had civil society organizations operating health clinics, TEX stands for temporary education centers, community centers. So really like a lot of, in a sense, kind of filling the shoes of the state in those initial years. After 2016, you kind of see, the 2011-15 period is also described as kind of a free period where civil society, including international organizations, were able to do everything, kind of informing the state, but it was really this free time. But in 2016, several very important things happened that changed the course of events. One is, of course, the coup attempt that you had in summer of 2016. And, of course, this created growing suspicion towards civil society in Turkey generally, but also kind of a re-emergence of the problem, the kind of Kurdish problem in Turkey, and some international civil society organizations that were providing cross-border support were suddenly suspected of, supporting the Kurdish allies, so like Mercy Corps, International Medical Corps, they were actually, their registrations were cancelled. So you had kind of this political pressure growing. But besides that, also, as I mentioned, when the government recognized that this was no longer a temporary issue and started or had the political will to move towards integration policies, so for instance, closing down the temporary education system, schools, and putting Syrian children into normal Turkish schools, or, closing down separate clinics and kind of integrating within the system. As this became recognized, the state kind of took ownership of, and the civil society, they didn't want civil society operating like a parallel system. And since 2017, you kind of, civil society partners are more recognized as partners, but in the sense of that they should kind of facilitate access to services and, strengthen state capacities. I can talk later about kind of how the impact has been more recently in positive and negative terms, but I'll stop at that. Thank you.